One teacher's laugh nearly crushed a kid's pride, but the truth walked in wearing a NASA badge. You ever have a moment that just hangs in the air like a bad smell? Something said that instantly shifts the energy in a room. That's exactly what happened at Prescott Elementary, right there in Mr. Said Worthington's third-grade classroom in Chandler, Arizona. It was career week, one of those annual things where kids sit cross-legged on a reading rug while parents parade and holding up props like stethoscopes, hard hats, or laptops. Some kids beamed with pride, others shrank into themselves, but everyone looked forward to it. It broke the rhythm of spelling tests and times tables. 8-year-old Jalen Brooks was practically bouncing in his seat that morning, small for his age but sharp as a tack. He had this wide-eyed way of talking, like every word mattered, and today every word did. His dad was supposed to show up later that afternoon. So, when Mr. Denton asked the class to go around and share what their parents did for work, Jalen sat up straight like he'd been rehearsing for days. "My dad," he said, chest puffed out, "works at NASA." There was a pause. Not the kind where people are confused. The kind where they don't believe you. One kid let out a snort. Another whispered, "Yeah, right," but it was the teacher's reaction that hit the hardest. Mr. Charles Denton, early 40s, thinning hair, khakis, and a tucked-in polo, chuckled. It wasn't a belly laugh. It was that low, dismissive kind, the kind that makes you feel smaller than you already are. "NASA, huh?" he said, raising his eyebrows like Jalen just claimed his dad built rocket ships in the backyard. "That's quite the imagination, Jalen. Maybe next time we aim for something more realistic." A few kids giggled. One girl actually repeated it under her breath. More realistic, like it was a joke they were all in on. Now Jalen didn't say another word. He just stared down at the rug, his sneakers tapping together, his hands, which had been animated just moments before, now curled into small fists on his lap. Mr. Peace, Mr. Pa, now curled into small fists on his lap. Denton moved on. He didn't pause to notice the way Jalen's shoulders sank or how quiet he suddenly became, but one person did. Millie and Gwen, who sat next to Jalen, leaned in and whispered, "I believe you." He didn't answer, just nodded slightly, eyes still fixed on the floor. The rest of the morning blurred past. Jacob's dad was a firefighter. Chloe's mom ran a bakery. Parents came and went, clapped for, thanked, hugged, but Jalen just sat there trying to disappear into the carpet. At lunch, he barely touched his sandwich, didn't laugh when the other boys started doing silly dances by the vending machines, didn't race for the swings like he usually did because something about that moment stuck. Not just the laugh, not even the doubt. It was the ease of it. How quickly a grown man, someone meant to encourage him, wrote him off without a second thought. But what Mr. Denton didn't know was this: Jalen wasn't guessing. He wasn't exaggerating. He hadn't made it up because it sounded cool. Everything he said was true. His father was an aerospace engineer. He'd been working on a Mars communications relay project for the past year. He wore a NASA badge every day. And more than that, he was proud of it. So was Jalen. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because to the person standing at the front of the room, the idea of that kind of man being his father just didn't seem possible. But the day wasn't over yet, and someone was about to walk into that classroom and change everything. 3 days before career week, Jalen was in the garage, with his dad helping clean out bins of old cables and wires. Well, mostly just watching. He sat on an overturned milk crate with a Capri Sun in one hand and a question ready every 2 minutes. Wait, so the rover has to wait how long to send a message back to Earth? Dr. Kelvin Brooks didn't even look up from the tangle of wiring in his hands. Depending on where Mars is in orbit, anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes. Jalen's eyes widened. So, it's like texting someone with really bad service. Kelvin laughed, exactly like that. Space has terrible Wi-Fi. That was Jalen's favorite kind of time. The simple kind. No big speeches, no complicated lessons. Just small moments with his dad where science became funny and hard stuff made sense because someone was willing to explain it. Dr. Brooks was the kind of man who could make a room pause just by walking in. But at home, he was soft-spoken. His hands were always either typing, holding a tool, or resting on Jalen's shoulders. His work was intense, wires, systems, equations, but when it came to his son, he made sure to break it all down so even a third grader could feel smart. At bedtime, Jalen brought one of the NASA folders from his dad's desk into his room. He laid it on the bed like it was treasure. "Can I show them this at school?" he asked. Kelvin looked at the folder. "Can I show them this at school?" he asked. Kelvin looked at the folder. "I don't think I'm allowed to bring classified stuff into show and tell, buddy." Not even one little page. Kelvin sat down beside him. You don't need the folder. All you need is your voice. Just tell them what I do, and tell them you're proud. Jalen hesitated. What if they don't believe me? Kelvin leaned back on one elbow. Then that's their problem, not yours. But what if they laugh? Kelvin paused. He wasn't one for sugarcoating. He knew what the world could be like, especially for boys who looked like his son. If they laugh, he said, you keep your head up and remember that the truth don't need applause. It just needs to be said. Jalen nodded slowly. He didn't fully get it, but he trusted it. But he wrote down everything he wanted to say during career week. He scribbled words like orbit, spacecraft, and Mars relay and bubble letters, drew a picture of his dad holding Earth in one hand and a satellite in the other. He couldn't wait to tell his class, couldn't wait to finally show them who his dad really was. He even practiced it in front of the bathroom mirror, the morning of. Pointed like his dad did when he explained how things worked. Even threw in a joke about space Wi-Fi. But none of that mattered the moment Mr. Denton laughed. And at lunch that day back at school, Jalen didn't tell anyone what he had prepared. He ripped up the picture before recess, crumpled it, and shoved it into the bottom of his backpack. It's strange the way excitement can collapse into embarrassment in less than a second. One moment you're on top of the world, and the next you're counting the minutes until you can go home and forget any of it happened. Kelvin didn't know any of this yet. He had been in back-to-back meetings all morning, prepping a slideshow he planned to show the class. Something fun, kid-friendly. There were cartoons of rockets and pictures of Mars, but his favorite slide was the last one. It was a photo of him and Jalen at the NASA Jet Propulsion Lab, both wearing matching badges and grinning ear to ear. But back at Prescott Elementary, Jalen wasn't grinning anymore because sometimes all it takes is one comment from the wrong person to make a kid start questioning everything. The rest of the day dragged. After lunch, Mr. Denton tried to slip back into his usual rhythm, like nothing awkward had happened earlier. He went through spelling words, reviewed math problems, but every now and then he glanced at Jalen, and Jalen never looked back. Jalen wasn't pouting, he wasn't crying. He just went quiet in a way that didn't belong to someone his age. Like something in him had shut off for the day. Milla noticed. So did a couple of other kids, but nobody said anything. Maybe they didn't know how. Career presentations were scheduled for the last hour of the day, so as 1:30 rolled around, Mr. said, Denton started lining the desks up in rows, moving the whiteboard easel to the front. The parents would wait outside the classroom and be called in one by one. Jalen watched the clock more than he watched the presentations. First came Chloe's mom, who brought in cupcakes and handed out little cookie-shaped business cards from her bakery. Then Thomas's uncle, a mechanic, showed up with a tire pressure gauge and passed it around the room like it was treasure. Kids clapped, laughed, asked questions, and all Jalen could do was sit in his seat, palms sweaty, knees bouncing, hoping, begging, praying that his dad didn't get stuck in traffic, or forget, or cancel. Because if Mr. Ketch in traffic, or forget, or cancel. Because if Mr. Pented Butch Denton saw him walk in wearing a real NASA badge, maybe he'd finally understand. But underneath all that hope was doubt, that ugly kind that doesn't ask questions, it just whispers things that hurt. What if he doesn't show up? What if Mr. Denton was right? What if my dad's not who I think he is? Jalen shook his head like he could knock the thoughts loose. Meanwhile, Mr. Denton stood near the door, clipboard in hand, occasionally stepping out to wave in the next parent. He was in his element again, smiling, leading cracking safe little jokes. But something about him had shifted. When he called on other kids, he glanced at Jalen once or twice. His jaw worked like he had something he wanted to say, but the words kept catching somewhere behind his teeth. Maybe he knew he had gone too far. Maybe it hit him when he saw how flat Jalen went after that comment. But he didn't apologize. Not then. Instead, he just kept the show rolling. 15 minutes left. 4 parents to go. Jalen check. At the door every few seconds now, waiting to see his dad's silhouette. The tie, the suit jacket, the slow, steady walk. He imagined it like a movie in his head, only now he wasn't so sure how it would end. All right, Mr. Denton said, glancing at his list. Up next, we have he stopped mid-sentence because the door had already opened, and there he was. Dr. Kelvin Brooks stepped into the room in a navy blue blazer, white shirt, slacks, and that familiar NASA badge clipped just below his breast pocket. His hair was trimmed close, peppered at the temples. His eyes scanned the room once, then landed on his son. Jalen sat up so fast his chair made a noise against the tile. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Kelvin gave a slight nod. No big smiles yet, just a calm, steady presence. "Hello," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm Dr. Brooks. I design spacecraft." And just like that, the room froze. Not with laughter, not with confusion, with realization. But one person in that room wasn't ready to process what just happened, and he was standing at the front holding a clipboard he suddenly didn't want anymore. When Kelvin walked in, the room didn't explode into applause or gasps. No one said a word. That silence, though, it was loud. He didn't need to bring props or flashy visuals. Just his voice, his presence, his badge. The fact that he existed in a space where most of those kids, and definitely Mr. Denton, didn't expect him to be. Mr. Denton didn't expect him to be. Denton blinked, lips parting slightly like he was about to speak, but couldn't land on how. Jalen was still staring, eyes wide, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And truth be told, part of him had started to believe his dad wouldn't come, not because he thought his dad didn't care, but because when somebody important doubts you, it messes with your head, especially when you're a kid. But Kelvin had shown up, not just end time. He'd been early, waiting just outside the door. He had heard every word from the hallway. He walked to the front of the classroom slowly, like he wasn't in a rush to prove anything. He looked over at Mr. Denton and gave him a polite nod, cool and measured. Then he turned to the class. So he said, "You guys learning about jobs today?" One kid raised his hand and asked, "Do you fly rockets?" Kelvin chuckled. "Not quite. I help build the systems that allow rockets to talk to us after they leave Earth. Think of it like this. Spacecraft need phones, and we build the phones." Another hand shot up, like space iPhones. Kelvin grinned. "Sure, but with really bad reception." That got a laugh. Even Jalen smiled. Kelvin clicked a button on the screen and showed a photo of the Mars Relay Project, a series of satellites in deep orbit. Another photo showed him in front of a large control panel. "What you're looking at," he explained, "is part of how we stay connected to robots on another planet. We make sure they can call home." One by one, the kids leaned in, all except Mr. Denton, who stood off to the side, quiet for once. His eyes darted from the screen to Kelvin and then to Jalen, who now sat taller than he had all day. Kelvin didn't make it personal. He didn't say anything about what happened earlier. He didn't need to. His presence alone had already said more than enough. But just before wrapping up, he paused, looked directly at the class. "By the way," he said, his voice calm, "I heard someone earlier say that working at NASA might be unrealistic." He let the word hang in the air just long enough. He turned to Jalen. "Well," he continued, "I guess some people have a different definition of realistic." And then finally he smiled. Jalen beamed. For the first time all day, his fists unclenched. He looked around and noticed the shift. The smirks from earlier were gone. Now their D's. Were wide eyes, nods, maybe even a few sparks of admiration. Even Milo whispered, "Told you so." Mr. Denton cleared his throat. "Thank you, Dr. Brooks. That was informative." Kelvin gave a short nod, then glanced at the clock. "I've got to head back. Mars doesn't like to be kept waiting." A couple of kids laughed again. As he walked past Mr. Denton toward the door, he stopped for half a second. "I hope your students always feel heard," he said softly, "especially the ones who dream big." And with that he was gone. But the tension he left behind that stayed. And now it was up to Mr. Denton to figure out what to do with it. Mr. Denton stood frozen for a full beat after Dr. Brooks walked out. One hand on his clipboard, the other dangling by his side like he wasn't sure where to put it anymore. He turned back to the class, but the usual control he had over the room was gone. The kids weren't looking at him. They were looking at Jalen. And Jalen, he was glowing. Not in a loud or smug way, just sitting quietly, shoulders relaxed, chin up, like someone who had finally been seen the way he deserved to be. "All right," Mr. Denton said, voice a little thinner than before. "Let's thank Dr. Brooks for coming." A few kids clapped. Mila led it. Some followed. Mr. Denton tried to move on like normal, but the balance had shifted. He started to introduce the next parent, but there was a hesitation in his tone, like he knew anything said now would fall flat. No one was paying attention to tire gauges or bakery cupcakes anymore. Everyone had just seen a man walk in who shattered every assumption that had been hanging in that classroom all year. After the final presentation, Mr. Denton dismissed the kids for packing up. Backpacks zipped, chairs scraped against the tile. The usual end-of-day noise filled the room. But Jalen didn't move. He just sat there at his desk, hands folded, eatly, waiting. When most of the kids had filed out and the noise in the hallway began to swell, Mr. Denton walked over. He stood beside Jalen's desk, shifting his weight between his feet. "Hey," he started, almost too casual. "Your dad seems like a pretty smart guy." Jalen looked up slowly. "He is," Mr. Denton nodded. "I can see that. I wanted to say I may have jumped the gun earlier." Jalen didn't respond. Mr. Denton cleared his throat. "What I meant to say was sometimes people make mistakes. We don't always realize when something we say comes out wrong." Jalen stared at him for a second, then said, "But you laughed." That landed. Mr. Denton's face tightened. "Yeah," he admitted. "I did, and I'm sorry for that. It wasn't right. I should have listened." Jalen still didn't nod. He didn't try to make it easier for him. Mr. Denton finally said, "I hope you'll give me a chance to do better." Jalen stood up slowly, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and walked toward the door. Just before he left, he looked over his shoulder and said, "It wasn't your imagination. That's really my dad." And then he walked out. Mr. Denton stood there, one hand still on the empty desk, the other now shoved in his pocket. The hallway noise faded, the classroom emptied, but the weight of what happened lingered, not just in the space, but in Mr. Denton's face, in the air, in the feeling that something had cracked open. It wasn't about being wrong. It was about what that moment could have done to a kid's belief in himself, in his family, in his own voice. And now Mr. Denton couldn't stop hearing the echo of what he'd said. Maybe next time we aim for something more realistic. It wasn't just a comment, it was a boundary he had tried to place on a child's imagination. And it had backfired. But not every apology gets spoken out loud, and not every lesson comes with an audience. At evening, the Arizona sun was starting to dip below the rooftops, painting the sky orange and pink. Jalen sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal. Dinner by choice. Kelvin leaned against the counter, sipping from a chipped mug that read Space Nerd in faded blue letters. Neither of them said much at first. It wasn't awkward, just quiet. Then Jalen looked up. "Did you hear him?" Kelvin raised an eyebrow. "Your teacher," Jalen nodded. "When I said you worked at NASA," he laughed like it was a joke. Kelvin didn't answer right away. He set the mug down, walked over, and sat across from his son. "Yeah," he said finally. "I heard." Jalen frowned. "Why do people do that?" Kelvin's voice was low. "Because sometimes they see the world in a small box, and when something doesn't fit inside it, they laugh. It's not always hate. Sometimes it's just ignorance. But either way, it's not your job to shrink for them." Jalen stirred his cereal slowly. "I didn't feel smart anymore." Kelvin leaned in, serious now. "Don't let someone else's doubt erase your truth. You know who you are. You know who I am. That's what matters." Jalen nodded just a little. "And you did good today." Kelvin added, "You told the truth. You held your ground. That's brave." Jalen gave a small smile. The next morning at school, something was different. Kids who had laughed the day before suddenly wanted to sit next to him. One even asked if his dad had ever met an astronaut. Another asked if Jalen could bring one of his dad's space tools to class. He didn't brag, didn't puff up, just answered simply and kept it moving. Mila walked beside him at recess and said, "They believe you now." Jalen shrugged. "They didn't have to." Mila grinned. "Still nice, though." In the staff lounge, Mr. Denton sat alone for a while before dropping a note into Jalen's cubby, not typed, not formal, just a folded-up sheet of paper. "Jalen Foe, undid after lunch." It read, "Jalen, I was wrong. You shouldn't have had to prove anything to us. Keep dreaming big, Mr. Denton." Jalen didn't smile, didn't read it twice. He folded it back up, slipped it into his backpack, and zipped it quietly. He hadn't needed the apology. But maybe someone else needed to write it. That afternoon, as the final bell rang, Jalen walked out with his head high, not because of what the class thought now, but because of what never changed. His dad had shown up. He was an engineer. And most important of all, he had told the truth, even when no one believed him. And somewhere inside that classroom, a teacher had been reminded of a lesson he'd forgotten along the way, that kids carry dreams bigger than most adults' expectations. And when we dismiss those dreams, we don't just shrink their imagination, we shrink their voice. Jalen stayed loud and clear and real, because the truth doesn't need permission, it just needs someone brave enough to say it out loud. If you've ever been doubted, overlooked, or told to be more realistic, remember this. Other people's limits don't define your path. Keep showing up, keep speaking your truth, and if you're ever in the position to believe in someone when nobody else will, do it. You might just change